So, good afternoon, dear students, dear colleagues, dear friends. I am Carsten Wilke, the head of the Center for Religious Studies, which organizes this event with Professor Frank Barron from Kansas University. Professor Barron will speak here as an expert on German literature of the 15th, 16th century, the time of the Renaissance and Reformation, as an expert on a personality in German literature that is of the foremost, namely the person of Faust. And Faust is linked to another personality that interests us in particular in religious studies, and that's the one that he did the pact with, namely the devil. So on this, from this point of view, his book, his recent book that we want to present here, will be of interest. The interference between magic, the myth of Faust, religion, and science, finally. But I want to say a few words about our guest that I'm very happy to greet here. Last year we had a summer university on Western esotericism, and especially the idea of divinization, of the idea to transcend the horizons of the human and to turn man to some extent into a god. And we also focused on the idea of the pact with the devil, on the figure of Faust. And the one author that was on top of our quotations and readings was Frank Barron. So I'm very happy to meet you here in person. Frank Barron is a Budapestian. He was born in Budapest in 1936 and immigrated to America after the war. He studied at the University of Berkeley and obtained his doctorate in German studies in 1966. And after his doctorate, he went with the Peace Corps as an English teacher to Ethiopia and spent two more years in conducting research on German Renaissance and Reformation literature in Munich. And then during a very long time, from 1970 till 2013, his retirement, he has been a professor at the University of Kansas at Lawrence, and since 1997, director of the Max Kade Center for German American Studies at the University of Kansas. He has been in intense exchanges with German colleagues, with German students, especially in Eutin in Schleswig-Holstein, in a partnership. He had frequent research fellowships in Europe, not only in Germany but also in Hungary, as far as I understand, before the change of regime and after it. Besides books books and articles about modern German literature, which focuses on Alexander von Humboldt, on Rilke, on Hermann Hesse. He has, as I said, in particular contributed to our knowledge of the German literature of the Reformation period, with a number of books on the Faust myth and the historical background of Faust, starting with the book Dr. Faustus from History to Legend in 19. A wonderful German book summarizing his life's work on Faust, the myth of the Faustian pact with the devil, history, legend, literature. In in German, and this is the book that we in particular want to speak about today. I would also like to mention another book that he has written about his experiences as a child in Hungary during World War II, the tyranny and oppression of the time, the topic of the Holocaust, and together with a Hungarian journalist, Sándor Szenes, he has published a German book, From Hungary to Auschwitz, the silenced warning, die verschwiegene Warnung, published in Münster 1994. And in 2011, Frank Barron obtained the Bundesverdienstkreuz, which is the Officer's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany, with, I will just quote one sentence from the Laudatio. Through this outstanding commitment and dedication to German art, literary and cultural history, as well as to the exchange between Germany and the United States, you have promoted German-American understanding and friendship. Today we are here, the three colleagues from Central European University. I greet Professor György Szönyi, Professor Gábor Klaniczay, and I. We are all three members of the Center for Religious Studies, and from our different expertise, Professor Szönyi on Western esotericism, among many other things, and Professor Klaniczay on witchcraft, again among many other things. I step in with comparative religion, Jewish studies. We will react and discuss with Professor Barron after his presentation, and I am glad to see that we have a recording with our Vienna campus. I hope it will work well, and we might also have questions from Vienna if I understand well.
It's not interactive.
No?
One way.
All right, one way then. So I am glad to invite Professor Frank Barron to start the presentation with an outline of his most recent book.
Thank you very much for this very generous introduction. The problem with such friendly introductions is that it can only go downwards after that. I mean, it's not necessarily an advantage, but I appreciate the introduction, and I have not tried to advance the images from here, but let's see what happens. First, what you see here is the title of Goethe's Faust, and it was really what got me actually excited about the topic, about this work by Goethe. Goethe's Faust was something I read as an undergraduate at the beginning of my German studies, and it really influenced me actually to go into the field of German studies. But I had no idea that story was had some historical basis. I really assumed it was a story of the imagination. I mean, Pact with the devil and this figure from history. So I didn't have any particular interest in the subject that then it evolved. And it evolved simply because in 1968 to 70 I was in Munich, and there are a lot of wonderful books there, old books, and I happened to look at one in which the name Faustus appeared. And so I was curious about why that would be in the 16th or 17th century. And then I quickly discovered that there was literature on a figure that existed in the 16th century and supposedly had influenced on a development that led to Goethe. So that was the beginning of kind of asking what's going on. And since my research for my PhD had to do with the 15th century, I was dealing with university records. And when I looked at what appeared to be a very reliable scholarly work on a historical figure, I saw that there may be a mistake in the evaluation of the early records. So what happened, in effect, was that there is a claim that the historical Faust was born in southwestern Germany, and that they actually even think he had a house there or whatever, and then now they have a museum there for Faust. But I thought that this was a mistake. In other words, the original records show something else. And you might ask, what, and that's the question that my opponents from this town, it's called Knittlingen, that's where this museum is, would say, what's the difference? If you locate this historical figure in another place, it happens to be near Heidelberg, how is that important? And that's part of the subject that I do discuss here, because I feel that it makes a big difference in the evolution of this Faustian figure in the 16th century, and it's a long development. We're talking about 250 years. Well, I spent about 50 years on it, but 250 is a lot more that you need to get involved in. So let me see if this works. If I think I have to be nearer to get this. Maybe it won't move at all. Can you help me?
You can also just take your hand and move it across.
Oh, is that right? So if I move it this way?
The other way.
This way. Oh, okay. Magic. I need help, I guess. Well, anyway, this is a kind of a vague summary of what I've tried to put together in my book. It's summarizing certain parts, and I mentioned this particular thing, and then we have two sections here. I'd like to give you an overview and then go into a little more detail. But according to what I found, there is this. There is a set of documents, not many, about 10 documents that locate an individual named Faustus in the early 16th century. And then there's a development that you can trace to Wittenberg, where Martin Luther spoke about him. There are table conversations, and in two of them, he's talking about a magician named Faustus, whom he associates with the devil. So that's one line of development, but the problem that I had to deal with is that this theory that locates the historical figure in Knittlingen and afterwards, they're using records that go beyond here. So it goes all the way to 1560. Here you're talking about 1530s, the last reliable record. So what happens is that if you talk to somebody from this town, and there are many books and records, I mean, they dominate, in effect, the literature on a historical figure, then you almost have a direct view from here to Goethe. There's not much change. And for me, the story is much more complicated. There are different stages, mutations that occur. And I'd like to talk about one particular one that is fascinating. It relates to some of the research that has been done here in Budapest. So there are two developments in the 16th century. One has to do with the influence of Martin Luther in Wittenberg and his followers. I mean, you may know the name of Melanchthon. He was a co-worker for the Protestant movement, and he also talks about Faustus. So it seemed to be a kind of popular topic in those times. But if you look at the result of these discussions, you do not really get a very useful biography. It's a narration about somebody who did some fantastic things, and the devil might have been involved in some fashion, and he was obviously worthy of punishment. But it's not developed very much. So there's no plot to the story. What happens at about the same time, and you may know this, that the persecution of witches was extremely intense, especially in the 16th century, and it really comes to a kind of high point in the latter second half of the 16th century. And so there are these two things going on at the same time. The life of Faustus seen from the Lutheran point of view, and then the trials of witches. In a way, they needed each other. The persecution of witches was aimed primarily at this time to somewhat unlearned women. That was the very common object of those who persecuted. The trials for witches did have a plot, and it was actually kind of a useful collaboration, theoretically, that there was a convergence. For example, you could take 1572, there was actually a law according to which if someone made a pact with the devil, that deserved punishment by burning, by execution by fire. So there was this persecution movement, and one could also point to the fact that although women were the main object of such persecution efforts, I think those who were engaged in persecution were also sometimes interested in learned or above average type of individuals, men that deserved to be targeted. And so there were more and more such instances, and so you had instances in which men of learning were accused of witchcraft and were then persecuted and executed. So that kind of helped to develop this story. And to make it short, the story Faust book is the result of that convergence of these two things. And it can be shown very clearly that in 1585 there was a book in which there is a discussion of the witches, persecution, and at the same time there are stories about Faustus, and that these things are related, and that this Faustus had made a pact with the devil for 24 years. That is the first time that idea comes up, and it's in the context of the persecution topic. So the Faust book has a plot, a very effective plot. The motivations to make a pact are not that clearly drawn, because this story is a polemic. It shows how terrible it is to be engaged in such efforts. Apparently it was quite effective. Maybe one reason is it had some chapters in the sexual adventures of Faustus are displayed, and I think the authorities didn't care for that, but that made it all the more interesting for many people. And this book was very successful. It was the most successful book at that time, and it went through many printings. So almost immediately it was translated into English, and Christopher Marlowe, Shakespeare's contemporary, created this stage drama. I mean, what I have found is that already in 1588 it was staged and was having an influence in England. This Faust play was taken by the English players to the continent and performed mainly in Germany, but Austria and elsewhere. But it had that had an impact. In other words, the line that goes to Goethe's Faust goes from Germany to England and goes back, and these performances had an impact, so that they continued even though the English players were no longer there. The performances were taken over by German players, and it was a folk play, popular. And Lessing and Goethe made this effort to use the material in their works. So that's kind of the general picture. If you don't mind, I'd like to use, I'm making it easy for myself, because at least when I pick up a book, I look for the illustrations. I don't read the book. I just and so I took the illustrations out to show you. But that's okay. I'll just get it out of the way. So I can. Doesn't want to move.
No. Oh, it doesn't move at all.
Could it get stuck?
I think you have to shrink it first.
Shrinking then.
Oh.
You take it out and put it back in.
Decided. What if we take this?
Yeah. Okay, that's it. That's
Is
the
this the right
next
one?
one. You're a magician, huh? Okay, well, the first illustration attempts to analyze the documents, just a few documents. I mean, here you have the years, that's all we have. But there's a certain consistency here, because the name, not Faust, because Goethe wrote Faust, Faustus is a different word. It's a Latin word that means something like fortunate, and that could be useful introduction for an astrologer. So you see here, the early documents show that he's a soothsayer. Also, it uses the palm to tell the future. So it's pretty much somebody who went from town to town, and we have evidence that he was in a number of different places. So that is a historical figure, but those who disagree with me, let's see if this works. Yeah, it does. Good. So these are the later documents, and this is what my enemies in Nidlingen would use, mainly because here there's a different location that's given for the origins of this person. So Herkunft means where he comes from, and that comes up very late in 1560. By that time, the legend is really full-blown. So there's a shift in the way he is seen, and this word magus, at least in the Protestant Lutheran circles, implies kind of questionable dealings. Probably devil is involved. At least that's the Lutheran position. And so it's also the German word Zauberer implies devil being involved. Although even here it's still astrology somewhere. So some material from the original historical document seems to have survived. Well, it's kind of fuzzy. It's not a nice thing to show, but it has to do with something that happened in 1540 in Wittenberg. So this is where Martin Luther was practically in charge. I mean, nothing happened like this without his approval, but they're executing 4 witches. The reason is that that particular year, 1540, was a year of drought, and it was, I mean, the records show that it was the greatest dry summer of the whole century. It was quite radical in that sense. So here they are accusing these 4 persons of destroying fields and animals. But what happens is they are tortured and they give in, they admit that they were involved, and this kind of thing can lead to kind of other events. They are torturing other people. In this case, there were a lot of fires. Forests were around Wittenberg were burning, and so they were looking for persons who were responsible for burning these forests. So this is just the beginning of a persecution wave, the result of which were about 20 executions, or 200, excuse me. So the witch persecution is already here, but it's not the way it's going to be later. I don't know if this is clear enough, but in this case, in Berlin, a minister of finance was Jewish, and the elector of Brandenburg died, and in that case he had to defend himself, and he was accused. And there's actually, this is a newspaper, and the whole story is told below, and it tells the stories that he made a pact with the devil, and that he caused all kinds of harm. But of course, even the fact that he was tortured is in a text. I mean, it's not hidden. So here's his execution. This is a kind of I hate to impose this on you because there's so much going on, it's really hard to make anything of it. So if you, here's the text. Here is this man who had been accused, and he comes up with fantastic confessions, which are then used in different parts of this witches' Sabbath. So the text explains, it's kind of strange because this happens in the Catholic part of Germany, but it's a Protestant who is responsible for the image. So you have kind of Catholic images here, so it's a kind of an attack on the Catholics who are doing such things. So that's kind of going back and forth. For me, this image it's a newspaper in effect. It goes back to about 5 years before, to an event, and I take a whole chapter to discuss the background, the historical background of this particular man. He was a professor of law. He was also a judge who was involved in accusing and dealing with witches. But at the same time, he was the richest man in the city of Trier. Practically the whole town was in his debt. Well, you could kind of imagine that there could be people accusing him, including the witches and others who were interested in not paying back the debt. So he was arrested and put to trial, and a professor from Cornell University in the 19th century discovered the trial record, the transcript. And that is an extremely valuable document, and there are scholars, a number of scholars in Trier and elsewhere who have studied this, because it's just so important to understand how such trials were conducted and what kinds of results they came out. The trials probably lasted over a year, and of course, at a very early point, they applied torture. He tried to admit to certain things, but eventually it was too much, and he admitted a pact with the devil. So it was executed, well, you know how mercy operates in such instances. Well, he was willing to go peacefully to his execution, and at Holy Communion, and because of his good behavior, he was not burned to death, he was just strangled. Well, that was the mercy that was shown in such instances. For this case and others, many others, allow, I think, a certain understanding of the structure of those trials. So what this would be the German text for the stages of a trial, and then first there is a threat of torture, and then there is a kind of an admission of guilt. But the next day, perhaps, or later, the victim will reconsider. I mean, is perhaps recovers somewhat and says, "No, I did not say those things. That's not. I did not mean what I said," and so he takes it back. The problem is that for the authorities, that doesn't work. So they apply torture again, and then there's a second admission of guilt. And then he receives Holy Communion, and then there's a public execution. So that is a fairly frequent sequence of events. What I'm saying is that the Faust story, as it's told in the Faust book, has a very similar sequence. I mean, the fact that he makes a pact with the devil is fairly clear and obvious. But at one point in the story, he's going to change his mind, and he wants to confess. And then the devil comes and forces him to confess again. And so there is a second pact in this apparently fictional book, the Faust book. And to me, this is a very clear evidence that the Faust book was very much influenced by the trials of the 16th century. This is the second edition. The Faust book appeared in 1587. It was not illustrated. But the image is interesting. Here is is Faustus, and he is talking to the devil. The devil is a monk. So this is a Protestant book. So monk is guilty, right? Is devil. And then one of the things that you can do when you make the pact, and he's agreeing to the pact, then you can fly. I mean, you have all kinds of powers, but that's indicated here. The devil is taking out. And that was something you saw before in the other trials. So, it's working. Well, I'm talking here just very briefly about what happens in London. This is just an excerpt from the Faust book in English. So this is a very. I'm taking just one little passage in which Faustus is concerned about damnation, and he's afraid. It's towards the end of of Marlowe's Faustus. But before I forget, I should say this on the whole. What's new, what's original about Marlowe's Faustus is that for the first time, Faustus can speak himself. He is allowed to say something, whereas in the Faust book, it was all a polemic. It only against him. He doesn't really get a good chance to say what is interested in. So here at the end, we have a very similar kind of text here. There's a Faust ballad that was printed somewhat later, but it's obviously very close to Marlowe's text. And so you can kind of see a change here. So instead of something very vague, the ballad gets specific about stopping the constellations, and then time is still. So then he would have time to repent. But in Marlowe, it's even more, somehow more dramatic, and he's wanting to repent, but he's telling the stars, so time needs to stop. It's an interesting concept that I think could be analyzed further. But I'm just showing how close and these texts are, but then very subtle and fascinating new images develop in Marlowe's text. This is an attempt to summarize kind of the path to Goethe. So here is Goethe. I have Faust is the first attempt for Goethe to write the Faust story. So 1773 to 75. I didn't talk about the saints' legends because that would be some extra discussion, but there were devil pacts already earlier, and in the stories of saints, which everybody knew well, there are stories about making pacts with the devil, but it's usually the topic is a saint, and then of course he regrets it and then is saved. So it turns out positively in the case of the saints' legends, but those mythological structures are playing a role in all these discussions here, in the trials as well as with the way the Faust book evolves. So this is the early history, and then here the 24-year pact appears. In 85, then the Faust book is written. Then it goes to England, and then comes back from Marlowe to Goethe, and Lessing is someone else who has written about Faust. But there are versions here, but they're not very influential. The main line goes like this and comes along. So what comes into Lessing and Goethe's hands are kind of stories, but not in the detail that the story appeared earlier. It's more because there are these stage plays, popular plays, which have the basic plot, pact with the devil, 24 years, and then the devil comes and takes Faust to hell. Well, it's a problem for Lessing and for Goethe in the 18th century. This is the period of enlightenment, and the 17th century was a process of discovery that people realized that the torture issue was causing some of these results, and so really to make a pact with the devil appeared for intellectuals of the 18th century impossible in a serious way. So Lessing was actually warned in writing on this. People will laugh if you're going to present a play on that topic. So Goethe in Faust does not say that there is a pact at all. That's the first version. But the second version, about 50 years later, is different. And he had an interesting solution. So it's not a pact, it's a wager. So the devil can do anything, can present what he is able to, but he has to satisfy what Faust is asking for. And he's not able to do that. So that is the modern interpretation. That's Goethe's contribution to force the devil to do something. It's not that Faust gives up and agrees to give up his life. The devil has to satisfy him. And you may be aware that the beginning of Goethe's Faust is this frustration with academic disciplines. It's also in Marlowe's Faustus. And so he turns to magic in order to zu erfahren, was die Welt im Innersten zusammenhält. To experience, to learn what holds the world, the universe together in its innermost core. That is what Faust, in a sense, is asking for, and the devil tries different things and doesn't really succeed. You know, there are two parts, so it's a long story. If I have anything else. Oh, well, Liechtenstein puts it this way. That's a stamp that I received in a postcard. So that's Goethe, and he's supposed to be talking to the devil. He's making a deal. It's not quite accurate, but devil bargains are common, even today. They're not necessarily in the sense that Goethe intended them, but I think there's one that you recognize here. Anyway, this will be the end of my presentation. No comment.
Thank you very much. I will let us open the floor to questions, or perhaps maybe we might start. Gábor?
Thank you very much for this very nice lecture, and also showing the complexity of how such a figure is being shaped. And I looked a little bit into the book. I couldn't read because I only received it very recently, but I see that in this book really one can see how literary and intellectual evolution is intertwined with a lot of recent matters relating to witch hunts. And my field is rather earlier, so the medieval origins. So what I would like to ask is that besides this 16th century German climate, some earlier elements of the pacts with the devil, such as the 15th century Malleus Maleficarum, or even earlier examples where the pact with the devil has been discussed on German territories. Also the iconography of Althofer, Dürer, and others. So does this interact in any way with the formation of the Faust legend?
Yeah, well, the Malleus Maleficarum is a work composed in the end of the 15th century and became extremely well known. I mean, it was like the Faust book, a bestseller. And it really does pretty much accuse women of guilt almost before you start. I mean, although I understand there is some research about earlier periods where it was really, it wasn't quite that one-sided, that the men were selected just as much. But I think that work is very influential, and then there are so many variations of it in the 16th century. There are quite a few publications, especially in the second half of the century, that elaborate and they're on both sides, actually. In a sense, there's this Johannes Weyer, you know, who has so many anecdotes about witches and magicians also, and yet he is trying. ultimately actually trying to defend women and kind of saying, well, men would be more guilty actually because they should know more. I mean, it's a strange argument, and it's continued in other works. That is, because women are stupid, they are not really the guilty ones. The men are more guilty because they should know. They should. I see a lot of evolution there. There are debates at this time, but I think it's a minority position where you actually say, well, that can't be happening. I mean, the double pact is not even possible, so that is part of it. But as I say, the second half of the century, 16th century, has the laws in which such actions are defined, and so that's why I think the Faust book kind of draws on those books too. I think my argument against this position about Knippling and this alternate position is that the literary historians are not satisfied with having a Faust figure and then just going and discussing Goethe. And this whole story is left out. That has been my effort to put this into this context, because the Pact is the essential plot. So without that, there is not really a very interesting story. It's what makes a turning point and solution and the variations. I mean, it's all there.
If I could have, I would like to have a slightly longer reflections on the book and on Frank's results, and then it will evolve into some questions at the end. I would like to explain why I find this whole topic and Frank's contribution to that fascinating. The two elements which particularly interest me are the following. One is that very interesting process, which is very well documented in this book, how we move from anecdotes, hearsay, legend, myth, and literature. It's a commonplace in books on Western culture or Western civilization that there are certain archetypes, human the Western man's archetypes, and one is very often mentioned as Prometheus, and Faust is coming after Prometheus as such a very important character. And I'm fascinated that there is an apparently braggart young student who gives his visiting card to Trithemius, and Trithemius is kind of joking about him that what a hubris, what a ridiculous man he is, and then he evolves in several steps into this really mythical figure of the Western civilization. So I would like you to comment on this, how you see the kind of universal or European or Western significance of this figure. But let me turn to the other point before I give back the word. My original background is English literature, English Renaissance literature, and I've always been very much interested in Faust. Actually, I wrote my university doctorate on Marlowe and centering on Dr. Faustus. And in English literary history, there is a big debate going on for a long time, and as far as I know, it's not settled yet, that when did Marlowe write Dr. Faustus, whether it's his first play or last play. And I always like to think that this is his last play, kind of summarizing all his achievements, worries, his very subversive character and things like that. So it's a kind of finishing the career. But in your table, it looks just the opposite. Now the problem is that we don't have an authentic text of Dr. Faustus. We have two texts, one from 1604, the other one from 1617, as far as I remember, the A and the B text. In between there was the Act of Abuses, so it's clear that the second text, although it's much longer, but it's already under the pressure of censorship, and it's much more didactic. Probably the first text is closer to Marlowe, but we don't know, again, in how many hands it went through. So that's an interesting question. And the last thing I would like to mention in connection with that in the preface or the prologue of Marlowe's play, there's the image of Icarus, and he compares Icarus or Faustus to Icarus. And Icarus is a deeply ambiguous symbol because he has hubris, he doesn't obey his father, he falls into the sea, but at the same time you can also see him as an archetype of curiosity, research, ambition, going for science and things like that. So it's not so obviously a didactic bad example. And as much as we know about Marlowe would be very much going for total ambiguities or very, very deep subversive ambiguities presenting Faustus. So do you see anything in the previous histories of Faustus which leads to this ambiguity that he can be a hero and a sinner at the same time? Or it's in German land it's a simpler story, it's just, you know, Luther's example for hubris and to be damned. I don't know if I'm clear enough.
Yeah, I think I can use what you say here to go backwards a little bit. But first, maybe I should have an opinion on a dating. I don't know if everybody's interested in that, but for me, this poem, it's a poem, I might even have it here somewhere. Let's see. Okay, well, I compare this judgment about Faustus, and the reason I have this date here is that the authorities in London approved a ballad about Faustus to be printed in 1589. And I've studied this text. This is the poem and a ballad. And because it is not available in a form at that time, it's only available later. There is controversy about whether or not it was really written at this time. So I only have this one fact that it was approved to be printed. But then there's a question, was it this one at this time? But when I compare the texts, the Faust book and then Marlowe, the texts are often so close that I'm led to think that there was a matter of almost collaboration there. And the printer of was given permission to print the ballad, also printed another play by Marlowe in 1590. There seems to be some connection there, as I see it. So that's one topic you touched on. The other has to do with Icarus, and that is fascinating. So if you go back to the Faust book, at first there's analysis of Faustus turning to the devil, and then almost in Martin Luther's words, somebody who is bad to start with is going to be continue to be bad, and this person was curious and wanted to kind of fly up in the air like an eagle, and such person will end badly. I mean, it's didactically presented, but using Martin Luther's accusatory language. But this origin of Icarus, I think, is probably this inspiration of the text that you have there. So people are not original; they always are using some material earlier, and so that's one thing. And then at the same time, in the same scene, there is this conversation that Faustus has with his teachers in magic. So he consults these people about what you can accomplish, and they say, if you follow our teachings, you will be as famous as Agrippa, whom the whole world honors and respects. So here's another mythological development. I mean, Agrippa, you may notice that he's a magician of the 16th century, but he's written books, and he's much better known. And even in England, his books are available in English translation. So there is a kind of a combination, a mythical development. You know, I think that's the tendency, especially with an author like Marlowe, to kind of combine. And so there is a development, in a sense, here towards Goethe. The idea that Agrippa was involved is not specifically referred to in the folk plays. But there are some things that would suggest that maybe his influence is there, because when Goethe's father liked Agrippa, and as a young man he read Agrippa. And so Goethe uses that also in his works. He doesn't look at the historical material documentation. That's his imagination. He's combining. So the evidence I use is simply that he doesn't call Faustus Georg or Johann, as the historical sources would, but Henry. But that's Agrippa's first name. So, you know, it is also doing the same mythological juggling, combining different sources. I think that's kind of my take on your first question too. I mean, that there's this tendency as authors pick up this material that they have new combinations, but ironically, it's old material. Goethe was fascinated by the 16th century. He has other plays relating to that. This is, I think that those first scenes in Goethe's Faust are really dependent on his idea of the 15th century learning that might have taken place.
Yes, I will go on. Thank you very much for your lecture and for the book as well, because I think I have understood only by reading your book this close connection between the Faust myth and the German context. One might ask why this myth that has been treated as something expressing the essence of the West or whatever has been mainly reflected in these two countries, Germany and England. And I think your reference to the Reformation and to the witches' persecution, the specific form of persecution, makes it clear that it struck a nerve from the point of view of this religious engagement with magic. What I also found very interesting is what you mentioned about Faust's voice. That Faust, who is so eloquent in Goethe, who is a mouthpiece of Goethe's entire philosophy, is in fact in the 16th century originals mostly silent. And well, probably the only larger text that he recites is his lamentation in the end, the Weheklage, when he speaks, which is also the part that Thomas Mann in his novel, in his Dr. Faustus, has attributed to his protagonist as an oratorio, I think, and which is only at the moment in which Faust recognizes that his pact with the devil has turned to his own condemnation, that he speaks and expresses himself. But before that, he is a silent, he's a secretive character. So I would like to ask you how in the 16th century this silent alliance between magic and science was seen to be threatening when Faust was not contaminating with his doctrine or with his thought, but by other means, by his example perhaps, or how would you see the threat posed by this pact?
Threat to those who, like the Faust book authors writing about...
Yes,
Faust.
And those who read it full of horror.
It's really hard to judge what the readers were and what they thought. There were attempts to forbid the book from being printed at different places. So, I mean, when you talk about threat, it seems that for some religious persons, this book presented too many rewards for making pacts. I mean, that one of the things that happens in the center of the Faust book is that with his success in astrology, he's able to get recognition, and then he's called to the court of the emperor and can show what he knows, and he's quite effective. I think that I don't know if this answers your question, but the fascination for the Faust character and for people who might be tempted to make pacts is the power involved, that you are able to gain power. It is, and that was felt as a threat by the authorities, it seems, especially other questions about the youth. You know, they might be tempted to make pacts with the devil. There are cases where people make pacts and then they're caught, and okay, well, that would be one thing, but I think this threat of power or interest in power, which is evident in the Faust book, then is expanded on or emphasized in Marlowe's work. I mean, more than knowledge, it's power, I think, that makes Marlowe's Faustus a strong character. I think that's evident. So there are quite a few things that the authorities might have been threatened by. You mentioned science, and I just don't see a great deal of it in the Faust book. You know, it's people go back to it and maybe think that maybe it's a part of a development, but I think that's kind of looking back from the Goethe's time.
Yeah.
So there's not much there for that, and it's more that the Faust book has a lot of material from Martin Luther. I mean, you can find hidden quotations, because this was a Lutheran writer, and the publisher was very fanatically Lutheran. One particular position in Lutheranism, there were others, but he was, you know, and I think he might have been the author of this book anyway, because of what he has written before. But science is the least of the interest there. I don't know if I'm answering.
Yes. I mean, Faust is presented as a scholar
No,
always, but his pursuit is not that of knowledge.
no, not definitely. I mean, he's a bad example, and so he's a scholar, but from the very beginning, as a child, he said the parents may be good, but he was bad from almost the very beginning, and so there's not much you can do after that to turn around. Whereas with Marlowe, you don't have that prejudice from the beginning. I think there's an identification that is really very unique, a unique contribution.
If I may, once again, I think that there's a fascinating motive in Marlowe, and this is a humanist motive. The humanists wanted to go back to the sources, reading in the original, translating the Bible, etc., etc. And Faust seems to be a philologist when he quotes the Bible in the first scene of Marlowe, but then he misreads it. He misunderstands it, and this is the kind of Aristotelian hamartia, that original sin, that he thinks that Saint Paul says that if you are a sinner you have to die, but he doesn't read on to realize that you can repent. And that's why he goes on the wrong track, because he doesn't believe in the possibility of repenting and changing his course. So he's a bad humanist and a bad philologist.
And there's nothing like that in the Faust book. So this is really quite original with Marlowe, this looking for a flaw. And
Perhaps,
It's fascinating how you're describing the evolution of the character of Faust throughout centuries, but I was wondering if there was an evolution of Devil's personality in this story. I mean, since it appeared and after in the next century. So how did this figure
how the
change?
Faust devil figure evolves.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, the 16th century has its own idea, and for me, this story is so much dominated by Martin Luther, and there are psychologists who have studied Martin Luther and how the devil idea was already probably in his parents. His father, a miner, was seeing devil in the mines. So I think Martin Luther's image of the devil dominates here. So he has a say in everything that we're doing, and of course, when you, as soon as you move away from the Faust book, there's a kind of a freedom of reimagining the devil, and I don't know, some of that is still with Marlowe. I mean, he's not really very given much of a voice in the way. It's more Faustus that dominates the story. But of course, when Goethe treats the devil, he becomes really a serious contender in the story. I mean, that's really a fascinating new development, and that's why you can't just talk about Goethe's Faust. It's devil is right there as necessary in the dialogue, in the search for God, or whatever that goes on. The two are working together. Recently, we saw a film called Mephisto. Do you know this film by Sabo, actually? Hungarian. And, so, interpretation. Now it's the devil that's the main character. In the film, they show staging, and Faustus hardly speaks. You know, it's just is weak character, and the devil is really, and that's a kind of an interpretation of Goethe's Faust, because he's quoting Goethe. So it's interesting how you can kind of shift, and it's just that it's really a serious dialogue in Goethe's work, and so that is innovative.
Yes.
Right, you've spoken of witchcraft and torture and the like. Those times were the times of the Inquisition, and it seems to me that there must be a very strong thread of the, what shall I say, the official church that influences and feeds into the story that you're dealing with. And one thinks of the unfortunate Giordano Bruno, who met his death in the flower market in Rome in the Jubilee year 1600 after 10 years of imprisonment and inquisition. And he was such a man, of course, a man of an academic, a wandering academic, if you like, an astronomer, a philosopher, certainly. How does the official church blend into the story that you've told?
Well, the Faustus story is kind of one line. I don't know if you can kind of generalize too much, but these methods of persecution have a history, and I'm sure that the Inquisition is related to it. I mean, it's not maybe different countries in which this practices vary, but they don't know of each other and use methodology. And what I've found is that you really, in order to follow this story, you need to look at how these trials were conducted. And then these were all trials, church trials, secular trials, so they know from each other what is effective. And it seems that in the 16th century especially, they found a way to try to deal with issues, difficulties in social, political conflicts, to try to find scapegoats and then go after them. my research is kind of narrow by focusing on witchcraft. I think they're not that distant of what you're talking about. Well, there are other cases. I mean, I gave you just 3 instances, really, these trials, but so much that's covered in these books about witchcraft, going into individual anecdotes, and anecdotes then are stories about people being accused and then what happens to them. And it's usually supposed to be a lesson, you know, that you have to learn from this kind of story.
Any more questions? I would like to come back to this, I find very fascinating question of gender in these trials. That you have an argument apparently between the authors of the legend, whether one should rather persecute women or whether the men are more threatening. So the Pact obviously also has some kind of marriage undertone, at least as far as the women are concerned. So there might be. What does the Faust figure as a man, and as a man who is imagined as a philanderer? In fact, that's also one of the services he gets from the devil. What does he express in terms of magic and gender?
Yeah, I think the Faust book uses one particular source extensively. 2 years before the Faust book is published, it's the author is somebody who's actually a professor at the University of Heidelberg, and he has this interesting position that, well, I mentioned this to the fact that women should not be persecuted because men are, well, should know, understand what is going on, and they are more guilty because of this knowledge. But there's a strange argument that women are not able to understand the devil and how he can manipulate them. So they are at a great disadvantage. And he's really very concerned. I mean, maybe this is an argument that he simply takes over from a predecessor. Johannes Weyer is a very prominent writer about witchcraft, and he had this similar kind of an argument. So it's not all that unique, but it also shows how difficult it was to discuss these matters. In other words, you had to go to these almost gymnastics to see what way you could stop this kind of extreme because when this man in '85 was writing, there were newspapers reporting on trial situation, but it wasn't just they were saying about 300 witches were burned in one particular area. That's in 1585. Then the earlier newspapers had been reporting only smaller numbers, but it was gradually growing. And so if you follow these newspapers, it's increasing numbers. But so what I see here is a kind of a strategy by those who were trying to kind of slow it down. So I do not know to what extent you can even find out who these individuals were that they were defending or accusing. But Faustus was one of those who was more guilty. So Agrippa is another one. He's mentioned. Tritemius, another one. These are magicians, men, and they are the ones that one should go after, these famous big ones, and the women should be spared. So this is one argument that's kind of prominent in my literature, the literature that I have encountered.
Because most of the victims were women at the time.
Yeah, the great majority at this particular time. But that doesn't mean men were also. I mean, when you look at the statistics, and there's maybe at this time over maybe 10% were men, rest of them. So, and of course, this persecution goes on into the 17th century, and it was very intense still in the first part, and then I think when they gradually unraveled this torture factor as a driving factor, that's when it started to unravel in the 17th century.
Thank you.
I exhausted you.
Anyone else?
No, thank you.
Good. Then I would like to thank you very much, and would like to invite you all to the reception that you should be invited.
Thank you.